Firms have to decide whether they stay open for business and produce some quantity of output for sale, or whether they should close down, either temporarily perhaps in the short run, or permanently in the long run, in which case they would leave the market. What governs that decision that they make? Let's try and think of an example, and we'll use an example which is, as best we can, gets close to a perfectly competitive market. So let's take the case of videos and video stores. So in the 1980s and 90s, video stores were extremely popular. They were all over the place. You couldn't turn around without getting hit in the face with a video store. The whole point of a video store, you may not know this, so you'd have to perhaps ask your parents about it, is that people would go to the video store, they'd rent out a video, a movie, overnight, and then they would watch it, and then they'd return it the next day in order to avoid exorbitant fines. This was a very successful industry. It was a booming industry in the 1980s and 90s. But with the advent of the internet and eventually of decent internet speeds, it meant that people no longer needed to go to the video store, and so because they could just stream movies online or download them illegally, so you didn't really need to pay for movies at all. So this resulted ultimately in the death of the video store industry. Incidentally, this is just a side note, these are two videos that you might have rented out and watched. 1980s, Flash Gordon and The Toxic Avenger, two of the greatest movies to be made in this period of time. I strongly recommend that you find them and watch them. They are so awful that they are great. Anyway, so the video industry went down the gurgler. There's Blockbuster Video. You may have heard legends of its existence. There's a derelict Blockbuster Video store. Okay, how do we represent this story? Now, we're going to say that the video store industry, at least in the 80s and 90s, was approaching or approximately a perfectly competitive market, because there's very, very many firms in the market. They're all producing pretty much the same thing. They're close to perfect knowledge. There are no serious barriers to entry or exit from the market. So let's say we've got the case where everything's going great. We've got a horizontal marginal revenue, average revenue curve, and we can see that the optimal output is given by the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost for a given firm, and we can then calculate the firm's total revenue. The average revenue times the quantity produced gives you your total revenue. What's the total cost? Well, the total cost is given by the average cost at the optimal output multiplied by the quantity. So there's your total cost. The difference between total revenue and total cost is economic profit. So we can see our video store is making money. However, with the advent of alternatives, the demand falls. And when the demand for the product falls, the price and therefore the margin on average revenue faced by the firms fall. And let's say that it falls to such an extent that now at the optimal output, the total cost equals the total revenue, which is the average revenue times the output. So the firm is breaking even. There is no economic profit being made. But things degenerate from there. Demand falls even further. Therefore, the price of the product that could be expected in the marketplace falls further. Now, in this case, we're going to draw in the average variable cost curve. So we're indicating here that we're talking about the short run. Alright, so we'll start off. There we are. The price has fallen. Now you can see that the price, and therefore the marginal and average revenue curve, has fallen to such an extent that it's now below the average total cost curve. Alright, where's the optimal output? Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And we can see there that the total variable cost at this optimal output is this much, and the total fixed cost at the optimal output is the remainder. Remember, we've got average variable cost plus average fixed cost gives you average total cost. So the total variable cost plus the total fixed cost gives you the overall total costs. These two combined give the total cost of production for 25 units. Now have a look at what will be the total revenue. Average revenue multiplied by the quantity. So you can see here that the firm now faces a serious problem. Its overall costs are greater than its revenue. So this firm is making an economic loss. Should it close? Okay, so here's where it's a little bit interesting. Let's say we look at the scenario where the firm stayed open. It stays open. So we've got our total fixed cost and total variable cost. And then we'll add in the total revenue. And we can see the total revenue doesn't cover all of the costs. So there's some fixed costs left over that have not been covered by the revenue, which means that the firm is making a loss, as we just saw. Okay, so if it's making a loss, should the firm close down? Should the firm close its doors? Well, not necessarily. If it closes down, does the firm collect any revenue? No. Does the firm have any total variable costs? No. Right, so that's workers, for example, and electricity and so on. No costs there, so there's no total variable costs either. Does the firm have fixed costs? Yes, the fixed costs are still there. The business still has to pay the rent at the end of the month, for example. It still has to make the interest payments on any loans that it has, so those fixed costs remain. So the fixed costs are still there. Except now, because the business is closed, the revenue is not being generated, so the revenue doesn't cover any of those fixed costs anymore. As you can see, by closing down, in the short run, the firm, or the entrepreneur, faces a larger loss than if they stay open and at least make a bit of money to cover some of the fixed costs. So, the slightly counterintuitive result here is that it's entirely possible for a firm which is making a loss to stay open despite making that loss rather than close down, because by closing down it would make an even bigger loss. But let's look at an even worse scenario where the demand completely collapses and so prices have fallen massively now. So we've got our marginal revenue, average revenue curve, which is well below not just the average total cost curve, but also below the average variable cost curve. Where's the optimal output? Supposedly, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. At this point, we can see that the total variable cost is given by the variable cost curve, and the total fixed costs make up the remainder. Okay, what's the revenue? Well, total revenue is average revenue times the quantity produced here. Now we can see that the revenue being generated not only doesn't cover any of the fixed costs, but it also doesn't cover all of the variable costs either. So if we looked at this scenario now, just focusing on these totals, we've got the total costs there made up of the fixed and variable. We put in the total revenue, so the firm makes a large loss. If, on the other hand, the firm were to close down, it would make no revenue, but it will also have no variable costs because it's sacked all of its workers and it doesn't use electricity anymore and so on. So, the only costs to be paid by the entrepreneur are the total fixed costs by themselves. In this case, closing down results in a smaller loss than if the firm had stayed open, because the entrepreneur will have to pay all of the fixed costs out of his or her own pocket and have to pay some of, for example, the workers' wages out of his or her own pocket, because the firm is not covering those costs with its revenue. In this scenario, it's rational for the firm to close its doors rather than to stay open.